A young man leaned against one of the piles of the pier and watched the passengers disembarking from a steamship. If someone had asked him later in the year, there is little doubt that this young man would have said his life began that spring day in 1871 and ended in the winter some months distant. But his mother would have disputed the former claim, and many, both friend and foe, would come to deny the latter. His true date of birth, by his mother's reckoning, was some 17 years behind him. Right now he was wishing his brother Mycroft was here. It would be a grand spot for the game. Even Sherrinford would do. Sherrinford wasn't very good at the game, but it was always fun to best him at it. But neither of his brothers were here, and he was left to make his own observations and deductions. The man coming down the gangplank now was a prosperous owner of coal mines, the young man surmised. He was well dressed by the standards of the merchant class, but he never quite managed to entirely shake off the coal dust which still coated the soles of his shoes. Would an examination of his fingernails show it there as well? The coal merchant was followed rapidly by a tall man with sharp eyes and a critical stare. His coat was of good material, but well worn. The elbows had been patched, and the sleeves, especially the right sleeve, had been worn quite shiny. A wad of foolscap covered with pencil scribblings stuck out of his left pocket. He was a writer, an essayist, the young man concluded. The foolscap was undoubtedly some spontaneous critique of the shipping industry that had come to him on board. If his brothers had been there, one of them would have crept away and asked the men their occupation to confirm their speculations. If he could have managed it, he would have done it himself. But he was in sight of his parents, and his father had decided ideas about the behaviour of a 17-year-old soon-to-be gentleman. The young man knew that interrogating strangers was not among them. Even staring at the people coming down the plank was a stretch of what his father considered proper, but he could always claim to be admiring the ship. He knew his father would approve of that. The third man coming down the gangplank was an old soldier from his walk, a veteran of the Crimean War, perhaps. But the young man's observations were interrupted before he could determine more. His parents were signalling for him to join them. The carriage started off towards home as he climbed aboard. As the carriage rolled along, the young man stuck his head out of the window and observed the countryside. The wind whipped at his cloth cap and threatened to carry it off. He pulled it off and sat it in his lap. "Sherlock?" came the remonstration from inside the carriage. "Yes, mother," he said with a sigh, and put the cap back on, holding it with one hand as he looked out on the countryside. "You have to be careful," his mother said. "Yes, mother," he replied. They had been away nearly 2 years. He was taller and stronger, yet his mother seemed to feel it her duty to nearly constantly remind him that he had left Yorkshire in the north of England for the warmer climates of France because he had been ill. She sat across from him in the carriage, prim and proper as always, not a hair out of place despite the sea voyage and the carriage ride from the coast. He knew that as soon as they arrived, she would be busy supervising the unpacking, assuring that they would be settled in again as soon as possible, and that everything would be in its place. They were not close. He and his brothers had been brought up, as was not unusual for a family of their standing, by a succession of governesses and tutors. He had vivid memories of these, both good and bad, but his mother had always been a distant, fuzzy figure absorbed in the details of the running of the house and the maintenance of the squire's social circle. His thoughts went back to the view out of the window. The countryside seemed little changed. The old road wound its way from the coast, skirting the moors. It was mostly dirt, except where they rumbled over a stone bridge or came through a village large enough to be cobbled. Mostly it was a brown ribbon winding through the green and gold of the springtime moors, which were broken now and then by the grey or white of a rock outcropping. Here and there long stone walls stretched across the land, even onto the rocky moors. Sometimes he could see ruins in the distance, some medieval and some much older. It was an old, old land, and it was his home.